had some interesting speakers through the day, and as with yesterday, Susan has put the recording up of yesterday's program online, so if you want to go back and see those presentations or share them with colleagues, they're available now. A couple of very kind of quick housekeeping points as usual. So if we can remember to keep our videos and microphones off during the main presentations, just to make it a little bit kind of clearer and cleaner for all of us. I'll also turn mine off, and then I'll turn it back on when we're coming towards the end of the presentations as a reminder. I think, you know, we all had the experience yesterday of somebody getting the button wrong and having the phone call during the presentation. Easily done. So just kind of check, make sure you're on your mute function. The other thing, obviously important too, we've got some good speakers today and we've got a tight program. So if you can use the Q&A type function, you can send those to everybody, or if you just want to send them to me, you can do that in the chat function as well, and I'll pull out some of the themes to put back to our speakers. Just a bit of in advance, we've just rejigged some of the timing slightly this morning just to give a bit more time for one of our main speakers, the Hon Phil Twyford. So we'll make sure we have enough time for that conversation. But if you're tuning in a bit later, we might be 10 or 15 minutes behind schedule. So that's designed in, not my mistake at this point. So advance warning on that. So I'd like to start this morning though, before we do hand over to the Hon Phil Twyford, but just to invite Linda Stewart, the CEO of CEDA, Central Economic Development Agency, to talk about next year's conference. Obviously, we're really keen as soon as we can of getting us all back together face to face. So Linda, opportunity for you to talk about the marvellous Manawatū.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Kia ora tātou and good morning, everybody. So first up, just thank you to everyone for joining us for this year's virtual Economic Development New Zealand Congress. I hope that you found the presentations over the past couple of days insightful and that you're looking forward to the next few days together. Secondly, while I love a bit of innovation, this year's virtual Congress is just one great example of that. I would have preferred to have been hosting you here in Papaioia in the marvellous Manawatū right now, but that, like much of 2020, had to be put on hold. So we look forward to the 2021 Economic Development New Zealand Conference, where we can all come back together and celebrate our resilience, take the time to reconnect, to reflect on our successes and learnings, and hopefully be in a new and brighter world together. And that's why Manawatū is the perfect place for our next conference. We are ambitious, we are passionate and proud. We are inspired and positive about our future. Our ambition for what is possible and our drive and commitment to making it a reality are palpable in our region. We are the agri-food hub of New Zealand, and we will be recognised as one of the top 3 agri-food clusters in the world by 2025. We have the people and the deep capability to back this up, with nearly 4,000 of our community employed in science and research, the highest number of doctorates per capita in New Zealand. We're home to 3 CRIs, 3 tertiary institutions, and multinational companies, including the home of Fonterra's Global R&D Institute, international venture capital firm Finisterre Ventures, and the global agri-tech accelerator Sprout. When you're here, you'll get a real sense that collaboration and innovation is in our DNA. With over $3.5 billion worth of investment coming into Manawatū over the next 10 years, including the recent investment by KiwiRail that will cement our position as the 4th node of distribution and logistics in New Zealand, our region is genuinely filled with opportunities, even in the face of this current crisis. And just as a side note, while we have the Hon Phil Twyford with us, if you could do your best to make sure that we do secure the regional freight ring road funding, that would be appreciated, Phil. I couldn't miss that opportunity. Those that know me will also be keen to hear what the after parties might look like in Manawatū, with agri-food innovation that extends well beyond the science lab into a truly exceptional food and dining scene, including a microbrewery for networking purposes, I, I assure you that our award-winning chefs and a wide menu of restaurants, bars and cafes, over 168 of them to be exact, will wow you with the very best and fresh local produce prepared to perfection. We can't wait to welcome you to the heart of Aotearoa, Papaioa and Manawatū in 2021. This isn't the Palmerston North that many of you will remember from back when you studied here. This isn't provincial New Zealand as you know it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Manawatū. Roll the video, please, Susan.
Kia ora. Welcome to Papaioa, Manawatū. This is a special place in Aotearoa where wonderful things are happening. A place where connections are made and relationships nurtured, where nature beckons, creativity thrives and perspectives shift. Here in Manawatū, you'll have it all, with a compact city centre that leaves time in your pocket to explore our beautiful backyard, take in some world-class arts and theatre, or get your adrenaline pumping with something more adventurous, and still be back in time to sample the best brews and local cuisine that rivals Wellington on a good day. With over 130 different cultures and 90 different languages spoken here, diversity is in our DNA. We celebrate the new, we cherish the old, and we push toward the future. Renowned for innovation, technology, and business, and as the agri-food hub of New Zealand, this is a place where bright minds and big ideas flourish, where global ideas become a reality. And we're home to the big guys too, with many national and global companies choosing to call Manawatū home. So, come join us. We're ready to show you what Manawatū is made of. This is Manawatū.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to do my pitch for the marvellous Manawatū, and we really look forward to hosting you here in 2021. Back to you, please, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Linda. And I think you've certainly set the bar high for expectations for sausage rolls at morning tea now. So I'm looking forward to that. So hope to see you all in Manawatū next year. It's now, though, my pleasure to introduce the Honourable Phil Twyford, Member of Parliament for Te Atatu and Minister of Economic Development. He's served in Parliament since 2008, and during that time he's held following offices: Minister for Urban Development, Minister for Transport and Minister for Auckland. Phil, it's great to have you here this morning, and welcome, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Patrick. Morena koutou. Really nice to be with you this morning. It's not quite the same as being able to chat over sausage rolls during the break or go to the bar in the late afternoon, but that's life with a global pandemic for you. What I wanted to do this morning is really just talk you through some of the key elements of the government's economic development program, what we've been doing in response to COVID-19, and your very apt framing for this conference, Recovery to Revitalisation. I wanted to talk about the Provincial Growth Fund and the work that our government's been doing over the last 3 years in that area. Also, a couple of the key policies in our microeconomic work around industry transformation plans and within the context of our overall economic plan. I wanted to mention the urban growth partnerships that I've been leading as Urban Development Minister, because I think they provide potentially a very interesting model for collaboration and partnership between central government and local economic stakeholders. And that's all really all by way of kind of a pointer to what the future might hold in this space, and really an invitation and a challenge for us to think about how we can build a much stronger bridge between central government and regional economic stakeholders, including the EDAs in this space. I'm sure that you've heard many times over the last few months that we're in an unprecedented moment in New Zealand's history, and the pandemic has called for an unprecedented both health and economic response. And I think that as a country we can feel very proud of what we've been able to achieve together in tackling COVID-19. New Zealand's record is enviable internationally, and we have a shared resolve now to manage our way through and navigate our way through the economic recovery and revitalisation with the same level of resolve and the same sense of purpose that as a nation we've brought to the public health response over the last 6 months or so. I want to also acknowledge the work that the EDAs have done, that you and your teams over the last 6 months have done in working with your communities to help them through this incredibly challenging time. And I know that it's been a huge focus of work. And I also want to say thank you to those of you who've been involved through the government's Regional Business Partners program, providing much needed direct advice and advocacy and support to businesses who have been trying to survive and pivot during this time. So I think it's a given that the government's response to COVID-19 has to manage the immediate impacts on the economy, particularly unemployment, the fiscal constraints, business uncertainty, access to markets, and so on. But I'm sure you'll all agree that such a break point in our economic history also provides the opportunity for us to address the longer term challenges that we face in our community. The desire that we have, and we've made it the mantra of our economic policy, that we want to build a more inclusive and productive and sustainable economy. We have the challenge to tackle inequality. Economic and social inequality in New Zealand is greater than ever. And of course, the imperative to decarbonise our economy. My role as a Minister of Economic Development has really two kind of core roles in this. One is co-leading along with the Finance Minister the development of our economic strategy, and then leading specific initiatives that are aimed at the economic challenges facing businesses and our communities. So let me run through at this point some of the kind of key priorities in the government's plan for the rebuild and recover phase. So the first priority is about investing in our people, and you will have seen, for example, in things like the $1.7 billion commitment in the last budget to free trades training and apprenticeships, helping employers keep financial support to help employers keep apprentices on, making trade training and apprenticeships free in certain industries is all about helping workers transition in this time to industries where they are needed and where there are opportunities. So secondly, creating jobs and improving productivity. So we've created 11,000 environmental jobs to provide employment and invest in our natural capital. Building 8,000 new state homes and $3 billion of infrastructure projects from one end of this country to the other to deliver legacy infrastructure, but also to create jobs at this time. The third point is about preparing for the future. We're supporting New Zealand to take advantage of new opportunities, directly assisting SMEs to shift to e-commerce, supporting decarbonisation through investments to improve energy use, and encouraging businesses to invest more in research and development. We've rolled out over the last 6 months a massive program of direct support to small businesses and entrepreneurs. So we've made a number of changes to the tax system to assist small businesses, $3 billion of business tax refunds, the small business cash flow loan scheme, and $5,000 for professional business advice, that is vouchers worth $5,000 available through the Regional Business Partners program nationwide that many of you will be involved in delivering. The fifth point really is about positioning New Zealand globally and ensuring that as a trading nation, we are able to trade and export our way back to prosperity. And we've made some big investments in the last budget, $216 million invested into NZTE, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, working directly with our firms to strengthen their access to global markets. So we provided an extra $55 million for the Regional Business Partner Network, and we think that's been really a high value intervention over the last 6 months, directly supporting particularly SMEs in a time of crisis, to put together survival strategies and to find a way forward for them. So tapping into local networks of expertise and working directly with firms. 1,300 registered professional service providers in that network. About 60% of the businesses who have used the services of this network for professional firms are firms with 5 or fewer staff. 80% have 10 or fewer workers, and very strong uptake from people in manufacturing, tourism, construction and retail, some of the industries that have been hardest hit. The assistance that we've provided to NZTE to ramp up their work has allowed them to double the number of New Zealand firms who are in what they call their Focus 700 groups. So these are firms that are getting really intensive tailored support from NZTE, allowing them to connect with overseas markets and global partners. Those 1,400 firms now are responsible for 200,000 jobs across the export sector. That funding will also boost NZTE's reach locally with a suite of digital services and tools to help businesses and to scale up their e-commerce centre of excellence. Let me just pull the frame back a little bit, and really just I wanted to make some comments about the government's overall economic plan. And we had only just launched the plan at the time of your last annual conference last year. And we've refreshed it a little bit in light of COVID-19, but the fundamentals remain the same. And it really the plan looks to grow and share New Zealand's prosperity, to support thriving and sustainable regions, and to transition to a clean, green and carbon neutral New Zealand. It embraces, and this won't be a surprise to you, it's consistent with everything we've been doing around the wellbeing budget and the way that we approach economic development. But our plan embraces a wider view of what meaningful success looks like. And that's because we understand that the health and the well-being of our people, the protection and enhancement of our environment and the strength of our communities, they are the things they are the bedrock that allows us to achieve our economic potential. The plan identifies a number of shifts that we have to make in order to pursue this vision. And the first is moving the New Zealand economy from volume to value. So the businesses, including SMEs, are more productive, and that means adding value to our products, not just sending them overseas like we do with so many raw logs on the wharves of our ports around this country, not just sending them to other markets to capture that value. Secondly, ensuring that people are skilled, adaptable and have access to lifelong learning, and the reform of trade training of our polytech sector over the last 3 years, I think, has been a massive piece of work to create the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Training, one nationwide vocational training organisation linked into both the regions and through to employers and unions, making sure that we are the system that we're building is highly attuned to the needs of regional economies and particular sectors and industry. but is nevertheless a nationwide organisation with the capability, which is long overdue, to deliver on the needs that we have to build a more skilled workforce. We're also working to increase the pools of capital available to invest in infrastructure and grow our productive assets. And this year we invested more than $300 million into a fund of funds through New Zealand Growth Capital Partners to build a thriving ecosystem of venture capital investment in New Zealand to invest in our Series A and B companies, those that get beyond the angel investor seed capital phase to need a bit more capital. It's been a weakness in the New Zealand system for too long, and we've addressed that. And the next area really is about working to strengthen and revitalise regional economies. And I know that's something that you will care deeply about and as part of your day-to-day work. Through the Provincial Growth Fund, we've invested to support regional businesses to grow, to build the infrastructure, whether it's rail, ports or roads, and communications infrastructure that regions need to take part in a modern economy. Since the creation of the PGF in early 2018, it's made a very significant difference to economies around the country, resulting in the direct employment of just under 13,000 people. But that is just the beginning. There are many, many more jobs that will be created as those investments and projects flow through to fruition. Interestingly, the PGF is now the largest regional economic development fund in the OECD when considered on a per capita basis. $2.6 billion of funding has been approved for 733 projects, which are underway throughout the regions. And it has ignited collaboration between local and regional councils, industry and sector leaders, iwi, and a myriad of Māori organisations and businesses on a scale that we haven't seen in New Zealand before. When the pandemic hit, we were able to reprioritise unallocated money, and some $600 million has been allocated in the last 6 months, refocused to address more directly the effects of the pandemic, including on worker redeployment in a number of regions. I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing through urban growth partnerships and that I've been leading with my urban development hat on. We know that for many towns and cities, the success of the built environment of the housing markets, the land markets, transport systems are critical to the success and prosperity of many of our cities. And we've been getting it wrong for a long, long time in New Zealand, and not just in our largest cities, but in many other regional centres. We have some ridiculously expensive urban land and housing, high levels of homelessness and social hardship that we simply shouldn't see in a country like this. And it's a failure of land use planning, infrastructure investment. And so we've set out to deal with many of those issues through reforms to the planning system and infrastructure financing. But I think one of the interesting things that we've learned really over the last 3 years in this space has been the power of partnerships between central government right up to the participation of ministers with local government and all the different local government agencies, the many agencies of central government and iwi and other stakeholders. And through regional growth partnerships in our 6 fastest growing urban centres, we've made some quite remarkable progress in changing the way that we plan transport, reforming the zoning systems and planning rules that allow our cities to grow, and prioritising key projects. And it's been, I think, a really exciting piece of work, and it's demonstrated to me how fruitful those collaborative partnerships can be. The other, just coming back to the government's economic plan, the sort of key headline shifts that we talk about in the plan, enabling a step change for Māori and Pacific economies. That's critical for addressing some of the entrenched inequalities we have, but it's also a recognition that Māori and Pacific economies, particularly the Māori economy in the post-settlement area, is worth a lot. There's very significant assets and ambition and a willingness to invest, and in so many parts of the country, Māori asset owners are stepping up and are major players in regional economies. And there's a huge opportunity for us to work with the Māori economy to open up that value. The sixth shift really is about developing a sustainable and affordable energy system. And this is really within the frame of the imperative for us to decarbonise the New Zealand economy and to build social and economic value in the process of that decarbonisation. The final two are really about using our land and resources regeneratively. So moving to more sustainable land use practices to get better environmental outcomes and to preserve and enhance natural capital for future generations. And 8, and this comes a little bit back to the urban growth partnerships I was talking about, transforming our housing market to improve productivity growth in our cities, towns and cities, and make housing more affordable, to fix the terrible social harm that's caused by dysfunctional housing markets, while also ensuring that we can invest less of our scarce national wealth in buying and selling houses to each other, and instead invest in productive enterprise. Let me touch on a couple of the specific economic development initiatives that we've been pursuing over the last couple of years that I think are relevant to this discussion. So one is our industry policy. Industry policy has been out of fashion for a number of decades. It was often caricatured as governments picking winners. And really since the sort of free market fundamentalism of the 1980s, it's been out of fashion. Well, we've brought it back because we're convinced that in it lies the key to addressing the long-term entrenched productivity problems that New Zealand has. You know, New Zealand is kind of a gold medal winner internationally. Our policy in regard to our economic policy settings, we're regularly, we top the league tables at the World Bank and the OECD for being one of the easiest places to do business. Our policy settings are regarded as being first in class, but we've had really low levels of per capita productivity over the last few decades. And we've been left behind by many of the other smaller advanced economies. We believe actually the trick to turning this around is by identifying particular industries and sectors where New Zealand has or is able to develop a competitive advantage, and having government partner very closely with industry and entrepreneurs, business leaders and the workforce to develop transformation plans that will allow us to grow high productivity clusters of large firms who can export effectively and penetrate global markets. And that's what the Singapores, the Denmarks, the Israels have been able to achieve, and we haven't. And so our industry policy, which is it's available on the MB website for everybody to see, it proposes focusing, and that's what we're doing, on some key industries. And we've identified agri-tech, the digital sector, and advanced manufacturing as three of the first of these industry transformation plans. And we have one with the construction sector accord, which is about tackling some of the entrenched productivity problems in the building and construction sector. We're also looking at food and beverage manufacturing, and Linda, that will be a big opportunity for the food and beverage agri-hub in the Manawatū. And so this is going to be one of our major priorities in the economic development space is these high energy, high resource intensive partnerships between government and these target industries. So I thought I'd probably leave that there and really just finish by saying that I think that as we work our way through the recovery, the COVID recovery and revitalisation challenges, the work of sort of microeconomic policy is one of the main things that, one of the main kind of tools that we have at our disposal. And I hope you'll see that through our response to COVID, through the work, the broader regional economic development work that we've done, the work around industry policy, the work that we've done with the urban growth partnerships, it all evidences a strong commitment by our government to work with the regions, to work with firms and the workforce within the framework of our economic plan and the commitment to a sustainable, productive and inclusive economy. And I want to really put it on the table in this election campaign that Labor's commitment is to work in partnership with the regions and with the economic leadership in our communities. And I think that the drawing on all of the work that we've done, the work that EDAs are doing and the skills and capability, the relationships, the networks that you have, there's an opportunity for us to build a much better bridge between central government and the work that EDAs and local government do in the regions. And I hope, should we be fortunate enough to be returned to government after the election, that we'll have an opportunity to pursue that. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Phil. That's a great introduction for the day. And I think a couple of kind of key questions that are coming through from that, which build, I think, on some of the points you're saying. So we've got a few minutes. So if you've got a bit of time, I'll suggest some of those to you. So the first thing, obviously, you talked about the really important role that PGF and to an extent the shovel-ready projects have played as part of that sort of response to how do we move regional development priorities forward. And we also know there's obviously been a few administrative issues kind of getting PGF up and running in this kind of first term as well that came out through the review. And then you made I think the really important messages around the industry transformation plans and the need to invest in those areas. So given that, do you see an opportunity for a PGF Mark II or a regional development initiative that would support both those aspirations around supporting regional economies and industry transformations? And are you able to say what that might look like at this point?
Thanks, Patrick. The short answer is yes. We're very, very proud of what's been achieved with the PGF over the last 3 years. I mean, it is internationally, it stands up against other sort of similar attempts around regional economic development internationally. We had to build capability really from a standing start in central government to administer that program. It's not perfect. It hasn't been perfect. There have been challenges and struggles, but that's the nature of it. I mean, if you want to do something that's really ambitious, then it's not going to be plain sailing. But I think actually an enormous amount has been achieved. Moving forward, what I'd be really interested, there's a few things that I think Labor would like to pursue in this regard. So one of them is to align the regional economic development work through a fund like the PGF, align it more with the industry transformation plans that are directly about growing these clusters of firms and sectors where we believe New Zealand has a competitive advantage. And I think things like food and beverage processing, like agri-tech, like the digital sector, these are really good examples of that. Secondly, I think that it would be would make sense to align this work more with regional strategies that have been developed around competitive advantage. You know, central government has no particular interest in kind of shifting the chessboard pieces around and having the regions competing with each other. We're interested in how do we take New Zealand Inc. forward? How do we raise aggregate productivity and prosperity across the whole country? And thinking of it as more of a national economic or an ecosystem where different regions and different industries play their part within that system, that's a better way of doing it. But aligning those strategies more with central government and the regions, I think would be good. I also think that we need a tougher focus on firm growth and productivity rather than infrastructure. I'm a strong believer that we've got to be investing in infrastructure to equip our country for the future, but it's not enough. And I think we've got to look at creating the environment where we can see sustainable enterprise and job growth and improved productivity in the regions. And infrastructure alone won't do that.
Yeah, I think that kind of messaging around aligning regional development, industry development, etc., with the PGF aspirations is a really important one, and I'm sure people would echo that. I get a very specific question just related to that industry transformation plans. Obviously, a number have been produced. You've got a few more coming. Is there what are the priority industry transformation plans that you might see coming next?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the first one off the rank, it was actually emerged quite organically, which was the construction sector accord, and it's now been in place for 2 years. It didn't arise, the driver for it wasn't the sort of high productivity kind of export clusters that I talked about. It was really a recognition that our construction sector is so important in the economy, both for the quality of the built environment and for the share of GDP and employment that it's responsible for. And it was being dragged down by really entrenched low productivity. And we needed to work together with the industry to try to lift it up and modernize it. That's been going extremely well. And it's been a wonderful illustration of the power of mobilizing private sector leadership in that kind of partnership arrangement. We've also are of the view that actually coming out of the COVID recovery, this more industry partnership approach also will help us in industries like tourism and how we build a more high value, sustainable visitor economy for the future. But as Economic Development Minister, I'm particularly focused on the ones that I mentioned, which are things like the digital economy, where in the space of a decade, we now have a $1 billion plus industry, some great New Zealand firms emerging from that, you know, competing globally, for instance, around in areas like cloud-based services, our software industry, our interactive video developers. These are really exciting, high value, utterly sustainable, export-oriented industries that are this massive potential for us. Agri-tech is one of the ones that we've done most work on, and we launched it recently in the Bay of Plenty, which you know, where horticulture is such a big issue. We've worked in close partnership with the leading industry body, Agritech NZ. There, we've got a whole program of work underway. One of the initiatives that's emerged out of that has been a plan for a horticultural robotics institute based in the Bay of Plenty. It's really exciting stuff. And you know, with horticulture such an important industry for the country, but it's been locked in this dependent relationship with a low wage workforce, and we want to not only lift productivity but improve the quality of jobs. Actually, automation in horticulture is one of the things that will make that industry sustainable. And advanced manufacturing is the other one that we've really pushed to the fore, and we're working very closely right now with, I was in Canterbury yesterday visiting some of the firms down there. There's an amazing cluster of about 200 advanced, many of them high-tech New Zealand manufacturers. So we want to know, we're working with them on what are the things, the workforce development, access to skilled labour internationally, access to capital, government procurement. There's a whole range of different things that we're exploring. How can we allow this industry to grow, improve productivity, access to new technology, and the goal that we have really is to grow large firms that can achieve that productivity leap and export successfully.
Excellent. And one of the, just if you got time for a couple, one of the other things that you mentioned obviously is that additional investment that's gone into the Regional Business Partners program. And you can see that the demand for that service that has been experienced in all the regions. We heard yesterday how the staff at AT had gone from maybe 10, 12 people pushing out the Regional Business Partners program to having 50 people working on that in terms of getting businesses to take it up. So clearly some real demand for that type of support, which I think is very much welcomed. Does that give you any sort of pause for thought for terms of what a future business support program might look like under a new Labour government?
Well, it's been very gratifying that the program was there, the people and the capability were there, and when COVID hit, we were able to pump extra resources in. The uptake and all of the qualitative data that we've been getting back from the program has been highly encouraging, and that's why we put another $50 million in the budget. So I think that there's an enormous amount of learning that has come out of that. And you put that alongside all of the other things that have been rolled out now to assist SMEs. Many of these things are ideas that have been percolating around for the last few years in discussion and debate, but actually COVID's provided the impetus. We've had to leap in, boots and all, because we know that so many firms are responsible for a vast share of the labour market. We're in an existential situation and life and death struggle, and many of them are not through, they're not through it yet. So we've had to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at this. A lot of learning is emerging from that. And I think that as we move through into the revitalisation, we're going to be in a great position to know more and understand more about what works, what produces value in this area. One of the other areas I didn't mention, Patrick, was government procurement, and we're moving quite fast on that. As a tool to achieve better economic development outcomes, employment, social outcomes, and environmental outcomes. The government, spends $42 billion a year. Until now, we've done very little to try to get better value for money. So we're working hard and have changed the government procurement rules and guidelines, and we've got some very encouraging early results on how the public sector can, for instance, deliver better employment outcomes for people, displaced workers, people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19. We're requiring every time a government agency builds a building to do a carbon audit of the production process and the materials used to ensure that we're reducing carbon emissions through government build programs. All of those things, there's some exciting work that we are now going to be scaling up around supporting Māori and Pacific businesses to get better access to government contracts. So
That's good. And then I'll let you go, Phil, because I'm sure you've got a busy day. And I guess the final thing I'll say, which is part comment, part kind of question that's come through as well, was you mentioned at the start that sort of commitment, that willingness to work with the regions, with the EDAs, with local government moving forward. And I think that's probably something that would be welcomed. And also the comment there about actually don't be afraid to empower them. You know, think about some of the sort of fiscal transfer. We talked about that yesterday with Todd McClay, about how actually we can be active partners in supporting you with those policy objectives. So that's something which I think we frequently come to in terms of economic development New Zealand kind of conversations. So Phil, thank you very much. We are unable to do the normal round of applause in these types of scenarios, but I'm sure your inputs will be much appreciated, and great, thanks again for finding the time.
Patrick, thank you, and thank you to EDNZ. I really appreciate the chance to be with you this morning.
Great. So I know that's made a good start for the program this morning. We're going to move on. I did say at the outset we were going to take a little bit more time for Mr. Twyford because we knew it was an important discussion. But it's now my pleasure to introduce Harvey Brookes, my colleague at Martin Jenkins, and Harvey's going to talk about the work that hopefully you will have seen previously, the Economic Development Recovery Guide that we did. So Harvey, I'll pass straight over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and good morning, everybody. Kia ora. Patrick, I should probably just start with the time check and ask you, given the previous conversation, which was well worth it, any hints on time here?
Yeah, we're still going to take the half an hour. So I've said that we'll push and we'll start with Ifor's session at 11:15, and I think Susan's told him that as well. So I'll turn my camera on with about 5 minutes to go and take some questions at that point.
Great, thanks very much. Can you just double check also that you can see my presentation that I'm sharing?
Yep.
Great, fantastic. All right. So good morning again, everybody. So Susan asked me to talk about the work that we had done with EDNZ on the COVID-19 Recovery Guide. And so that's what I'm going to talk through today. I just want to start with an acknowledgement to David Wilson at Cities and Regions, and Patrick, my colleague, and also to EDNZ, who actually funded the development of the guide. So in the time that I've got this morning, I do want to just quickly recap on the guide for those who haven't seen it, but I won't go into a great deal of detail because I imagine many of you have already taken a look at it. But I also just really wanted to sort of provide a little bit of context, but you've had heaps and heaps of really excellent analysis from people about where we are in terms of COVID-19 and its economic development impact. So I won't go into detail, but just have a bit of a look around New Zealand in terms of how cities, districts and regions have led recovery in so much as it's evidenced by explicit development of recovery plans, and then a few thoughts about where to from here. So obviously it's a complex challenge, and when I've sort of looked at this in terms of recovery planning and what's happened around New Zealand, where we started in our guide, and I think where a lot of people started was around the rubric of response and recovery that's got its inheritance in the civil defence framework. But maybe what's interesting about that when you stop and think about it for a second is that what it implies is a recovery from often a single event, which is fairly linear in nature, and that there is a return to something like business as usual. And that certainly hasn't really been the case here. As I said, most areas have used that kind of civil defence function and existing structures to coordinate and manage their responses very, very well. A question would be, as we move forward from this point, given the nature of this event, is that necessarily sufficient? And that's about these new dynamics that you're all very, very familiar with. Questions such as, is this a short-term event? I think I heard people in the last couple of days saying that it is. I suppose that depends on things like vaccines, or is it more a rolling series of events that range in magnitude and impact? There is already at least to an observer, I think a hint of a gradual movement from an elimination strategy to a containment strategy. So what does that mean as well from a recovery point of view? And that then pushes us into thinking more about agility and the ability to deal with isolated outbreaks and localized impacts on our economy. Also, I think if anyone had predicted the shift that this has caused in things like digital working, the fact that we're holding a very successful conference digitally, just proves that what we knew 15 weeks ago compared to what we know now is quite incredible in terms of the difference. And I think some of these economic impacts are going to be more complex and harder to predict than we necessarily thought, and that's going to have implications. This diagram here, and I apologize for the smallness of it, but I just thought it was a really, really great way to conceptualize this. This is from McKinsey, and Nick Davis at Martin Jenkins put me onto this. And it basically looks at responses across two dimensions: the economic policy response on the X-axis and the health response on the Y. And I don't want to get into the shape of curves because there's heaps and heaps of discussion and debate about that. But what McKinsey have said basically is that most countries in the world now are in this blue area here, where their economic response has been moderate, but not necessarily outstanding, and their public health response has been good to very good. And so what that means is that the recovery is going to be sort of some variant of a U-type shape. But if there are continued outbreaks of an isolated nature, that's going to attenuate the shape of that. And we're going to get this kind of shape we can see in the black dot here, which is a sort of a long U shape, but with this kind of sawtooth pattern to it as we go along. And I think that's really, really important for how people plan for recovery. It's not going to be that straightforward, linear, we're in, we're out type of experience. Perhaps another way to look at this is from a psychosocial perspective, and this is based on a diagram that was developed by the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority a few years ago, and Eamon Chen at Martin Jenkins has done some work to further elaborate on this. And so if we think about the experience that we've had, and I think this actually works very well for COVID-19, when we got to 0 cases, whenever it was, June or so, I think, when we went into lockdown, I think we all really, really felt, we've got this, and the whole country got in behind, and we had the experience of more cases, and then we came out to this point here in late June, where we got the cases back to 0, and there was that sense of shared survival, and the little diagrams there are dancing. I think even the Prime Minister said that she had a little dance, and I think our implicit expectation was that from there was going to be a fairly linear recovery process, maybe some ups and downs, but that we'd get back to something like business as usual over the course of a few years. But the reality is probably going to be something a bit more like this. And I think this is probably how we deal as individuals and communities with any significant disruption. And maybe it's what we should be planning for, at least in terms of how we scope out recovery. And so I won't read it all, but obviously it's sort of like the 5 stages of grief in terms of disappointment, anger, and frustration. And I've just indicated with the red line that maybe that's where we are now, and maybe that's the experience that we're going through, partly as a result of the second outbreak, but maybe just as an inevitable process that communities go through as they deal with a major dislocation and a major change as we've had. So the point of this really is to say, are we in our recovery planning process, not only in terms of economic development, but more generally thinking around some of these slightly more complex dynamics. So the guide, and as I said, I'm not going to go through this in nauseating detail, but just for those who perhaps haven't had a chance to have a look at it, we developed this in April or May, so right at the beginning of that curve, to help people like you develop your recovery programs from COVID-19. It's a very generalized approach, gives you lots of tips and tricks to think about what to do, but it really does leave it up to each area to decide how to do that, and hopefully to be more resilient and agile and sustainable. And we did talk a lot in the guide about things like building back better and the opportunity to get on a better path towards sustainable growth. So it was designed for economic development, but it is definitely adaptable beyond that. And when I've looked at recovery plans across New Zealand, interestingly, only a very small minority of them are actually exclusively economic development recovery plans. Most of them go a lot further than that. So the model stages, we too started with civil defence as our starting point. We looked at some of the recovery plans that already existed from things like Christchurch and Kaikoura. And then we looked internationally at best practice models around the world in terms of economic recovery, and that not only takes in pandemics and natural disasters, but the global financial crisis and that type of thing. And where there are new trends, we picked those up as well. So the model has three stages to it, which you can see there on the right of the screen. Leadership, strategy and action, and I suspect that's a fairly well-worn path in terms of anyone looking to put a strategic approach together on anything. It implies that you start at the very beginning, but that's not necessarily the case. It depends on what you've got in play and in place already, and you can move backwards and forwards through the framework. And it's got that review and learning loop in it so that you can refine and improve as you go along. Importantly, it has a horizon or a time-based approach, especially in the action setting, and I'll get to that in a minute. So for each of those 3 stages, we've broken that into 3 steps, so that gives you 9 steps overall, plus then a 10th step about review. So what each of those things does is it introduces the topic, its objective, why it's important, the key steps, the tips for economic development practitioners, some specific case studies and examples, and then links to additional resources. The drivers, which are the black and white symbols you can see at the bottom of the page here, are the foundation for actions. And we could have used any number of these. We tried to keep it to a small number, so we've used those that are fairly common in terms of economic development, competitiveness type frameworks, but it can be expanded to other well-beings as well. And many of the recovery plans that I've seen do certainly go beyond those. So just to quickly recap then on each of those stages and steps. Step 1 and stage 1 is about convening a leadership team, and most certainly for local authorities, that was almost a default step because they are required by civil defence legislation to have recovery, response and recovery leadership infrastructures in place already. The extent to which districts and EDAs have gone beyond that in terms of a specific economic recovery leadership team is a little bit more variable at this time, but it's a horses for courses thing. Aligning with civil defence, again, is a fairly self-evident thing to do, but that sometimes wasn't necessarily strongly in place before this pandemic, and maybe this event is a little bit unusual in terms of the very, very strong link between the event itself and economic development impacts that arose out of that. But I think probably as people have gone along, that has sort of sorted itself out. But probably now that we're into the recovery phase of this, the civil defence element of it is perhaps not as strong as it was at the beginning when we were actually in a national civil defence emergency. The third one is incredibly important and is about leveraging the communication systems that you have in place to get information out. And one of the things I think that's been really, really great to see around New Zealand is just how much everybody has stood up in terms of using the communication channels they have and upping their game in terms of communicating information and services and advice across the economic development ecosystem. The second stage there is all about strategy and has those 3 steps there. Now the first one is making sure that you're aligned with your existing regional or local economic development strategies. And one of the key things there is not to reinvent the wheel. And you pretty much heard Phil Twyford talking about that as well, I suppose, in a way. And that's important to stay the course, but also to do a rapid review of what you've got as strategy and make sure that it's fit for purpose for this particular event and is taking into account local, national and international trends with this particular event as well. Building scenarios anyone who's a follower of Treasury and the Reserve Bank will of course be watching scenarios with a great deal of interest. And the point really here is that it's about being explicit about the recovery assumptions that you are making, the response assumptions that you are making, so that when circumstances do change, that you are ready to understand that and not just act in a vacuum. And then thirdly, the monitoring and evaluation framework and prioritization, I should say, there too, to make sure that you don't just take a scattergun approach to prioritizing actions, but also that you have a framework in place so then when we all get to the end of this and we ask ourselves what did we achieve and how much did it cost and was it worth it, that there is the evidence there to evaluate that impact post hoc. The last stage there is when the horizons come in, and that really, everybody I think has taken this approach or a variant of that approach, and everyone's used one or many words beginning with R to describe that. So in our model, we broke it down into 3 horizons: the response, the recovery, and the reimagination. And we've seen resilience and reimagination, pardon me, and we've seen everybody using different versions of this. We put time frames on this, sort of the response being in the first few weeks, and that really is where civil defence is really in the driver's seat. The medium term then is the sort of the first 12 to 24 months, and then the resilience and reimagination is beyond that. My own experience just working with 1 or 2 clients is that the recovery is the short term actually in some regards can be a little bit shorter than that, perhaps related more closely to annual planning cycles where they can be very, very certain about resources, and then longer term can link to things like long-term plans where bigger decisions need to be made. So just in terms of the actions then and the use of the drivers and the time horizons, this is just an example of 1 page from the guide looking at a particular driver. This one is improving business performance, and I'm not going to read all of this out, you'll be relieved to hear. But just to show you, as you can see there, that we've indicated the 3 horizons: the response, recovery, and resilience and reimagination. The kind of partners there, depending on where your video boxes are on your screen, you might not be able to see that, but we've listed partners that you can work with, and then at the far right is where you can go to get further information about that. So this is a menu of actions. It's not necessarily directing anybody to definitely do these things, but it is something that everyone can work their way through and decide which of these particular actions at which particular time frame are most relevant for them. The last thing in the guide then also is a template, and this is very much a generalized template to help people who perhaps are not too sure where they want to start on a recovery plan, and it gives you a series of headings that you can work for, very, very much based on the guide, and hopefully makes things a little bit easier in terms of how to build that plan up. So just some observations from me on the experience so far. And the way that I've done this is to actually spend a little bit of time visiting the websites of all the local authorities in New Zealand and all the EDAs. So I've had a look at 94 websites and tried to see sort of what kind of patterns there are, both in terms of the style of plans, the presence of plans, and the content of plans. So the first observation is that if you look at those 94 websites, you find that information provision is the key tool that's used by practically everybody. And the amount of information being provided and the quality of it has certainly gone up hugely, and I think that's a real credit to absolutely everybody. So, you know, the bare minimum was links to the government's COVID-19 websites, that type of thing, but also pretty much all local authorities and EDAs have then gone and listed the local and national services that are available to people in their district or their area. Data has become incredibly important, and I think we've all become very, very hungry for data as we've been so unsure about what's happening. And a lot of EDAs and councils have been producing regular monitors on the state of their local economies. And I've just shown here on the right, for example, an example from Te Waka on the Waikato, which I'm very, very familiar with. And this is just one sheet from their monthly monitor, which I think is outstanding. And there are very, very many examples of this. And what this does is it just helps people in the economic development ecosystem to understand what's going on and be better prepared for the future. The other thing that is really, really obvious in these plans, especially those from local authorities, is that there's been a huge effort to streamline existing services, especially in the regulatory space. There's been support and funding for people wanting to get consents, get on with doing things. As the Minister said, there's been a huge increase in things like the Regional Business Partner Program, and EDAs and councils have been really, really energetic in getting that word out there. For me, it's interesting. I think business friendly is definitely in. I think circumstances have meant that right now all councils really, really need to be business friendly, and they are. And that's really, really impressive to see. On the additional and new services front, there are some new services that you can see across districts and regions in New Zealand, mainly in the form of grants and recovery funds that are targeted towards particular groups and organisations, usually existing groups, and mainly around social services support. So whether that be food banks, helping community support organisations and community good organisations to deal with the impacts of job losses and other social impacts arising from COVID-19 in the short term. Some have expanded to refer to other services, so sort of going beyond their traditional role. So, using their advocacy voice to talk about the needs in terms of housing, education and health. But by and large, I think if you look across these plans, for everybody, government is still the big player, and that is really where the vast majority of resources are coming from, whether it be in terms of those business support services or in terms of infrastructure and so forth. When I've looked across those websites, and I should just qualify too that the way that I've done that is to Google the name of the entity and then the two words COVID recovery, and then I've used the 3-click test. If I can't find a recovery plan within 3 clicks, I've assumed that it's either too well buried for me to find it or it doesn't exist. But at this point, interestingly, a minority of those 94 websites actually have an explicit recovery plan on them. So there's the result looking at local authorities. So at least from my test, around about 42% of local authorities have published a COVID-19 recovery plan. It might not be just economic development, it could be all aspects of recovery, but 58% haven't, or it's not that easy to find on their websites. This one might cause a bit of a gulp in the virtual audience. I could only find 19% of EDAs with an explicit recovery plan. Now, I think there's probably some good reason for this, because if you're an EDA working with a district and a region and other organisations, there's probably no point you having your own recovery plan if your own local authorities have one. But that still struck me as a slightly low number at this particular point in the process. And similarly, also when I looked across all local authorities and EDAs, while everybody's had recovery leadership infrastructures, whether it's through civil defence or through existing economic development committees or what have you, only about 16% of all those organisations I looked at have a dedicated recovery team. So conclusions. from looking at all those plans so far, I think while economic development and having a recovery plan around ED is important, I think inevitably an all well-beings approach may actually be more useful. And that seems to be the way that most people have gone. There's still remaining uncertainty around the direction of the pandemic and its structural effects, and that will certainly influence planning. And I suspect what that will mean is people will need to go through several rounds of recovery planning as this thing goes. Everyone's providing useful information, but not everyone has a plan. I didn't see actually a great deal of signs of reimagination or getting into the really bold stuff that people like Rebecca Mills had spoken about in March and April this year. I just wonder whether fiscal constraints are perhaps driving that in terms of the ability, especially of local government, to get into big new things at this time. Maybe long-term plans, which everyone's working on now, is where we're going to see that in the future. I think maybe for those who maybe haven't developed a plan, I think the value of excellent plans may actually be just ahead of us as the wage and business subsidies come to an end, as we may see additional isolated waves of infection and our border controls maybe go on for longer than we would like them to. But out of all of this, leadership and resilience and adaptability are certainly key. And there is the role of central government is incredibly important and I'm sure will not diminish. Just one last point from all of that, and I applied my own Google test to the government. And while there's loads and loads of information, I don't think I can say with any confidence that other than the budget, that I found a national economic recovery plan as well. So maybe that's something that the government could be thinking about as we go into this next phase of things. So happy to answer any questions, Patrick.
Great, thank you very much, Harvey. A couple of quick questions so that we don't go too far behind. Firstly, have you got any thoughts and observations about how we need to think about the sort of moving in and out of different levels? So clearly we're in a process whereby we've obviously in Auckland gone into another level of lockdown. The level has changed to level 2 outside of Auckland as well. Realistically, that might happen again. And the process of developing, implementing, moving forward with the recovery plan also needs to change. So any sort of observations about how we should be thinking about managing that sort of fluid state that we find ourselves in?
Well, I mean, that's the reason I showed that psychosocial plan at the beginning and some of that stuff from McKinsey, because I think, I mean, I can only speak for myself, Patrick, and maybe you'd like to observe too. When we wrote the recovery plan, I think there was a sort of degree of an unconscious degree of linearity about how that thing was written. It was kind of an in and out process. So I think all I can really do is agree with you. I think the way that we look at this now has to be a little bit more dynamic. And we have to think about, what's our responses based upon what sort of alert level we are at and what sort of impact that is having. And we may need to have tools that we tune up and tune down depending on that. So I think it's a much less certain, much less linear type of planning approach that we need.
So recovery is a process, not an event. Final kind of question from me is relating to, obviously we looked at international practice at the time, but your sort of observations since then about, is anywhere doing anything particularly interesting we should reacquaint ourselves with or we should have a look at?
Internationally, that may be something which others are probably better equipped to talk about, because I really paid more attention to looking at what had happened in New Zealand. And so I'm not trying to dodge the question. I would just say that, every recovery plan I've looked at is online. And there's quite a range of styles and approaches there, from a very simple kind of one sheet table through to something that's 50 or 60 pages long. And as I said, some of them are economic, many of them go far, far further than that. So I would just encourage people to have a look around at those ones that are in New Zealand. I think they probably cover the full gamut of approaches that people can take, and work with your EDA board or your councillors and your community and figure out what will work best for you.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Harvey. And just a reminder, Susan's put it up there, but the guide, the template, as well as examples of other recovery plans, etc., are all available on the EDNZ website. So you can find quite a lot of information there and access to other resources that might be beneficial. So lastly, we are running as advertised, slightly behind our published schedule, but we wanted to make time at the start for Phil Twyford. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ifor Ffowcs Williams. Fits very well with the conversation that was initiated in part by Phil Twyford this morning, talking about clusters as a economic recovery mechanism. Ifor, many of you will know, he's the CEO and founder of Cluster Navigators, been an advocate and an expert in this space for a considerable period of time. So it's great that we've got you here this morning, Ifor, and to get your insights before the lunch break. So Ifor, over to you. Again, I'll give you the sort of the full half an hour that we talked about, and I'll come back in for questions. So hopefully people can stay to the end of that session.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for that introduction. Now I'm just trying to, how do I open up my, how do I, okay.
Should have a little green share screen button. There we go, that's it.
There, okay. Thank you. Okay, ready to roll. And what I want to share with you follows on very well from what we've just been hearing about from Harvey. Unlike the way in which this framework has been developed for reinvigorating, reigniting our regional economies. And I'm particularly going to drill down on one of the recommendations, highlighting specializations and established clusters of firms. And great to hear from the Minister in the first session this morning, talking about clusters and talking about clusters for the first time, for a long time, from a New Zealand minister, talking about clusters as a regional phenomenon. And like the way he talked about Hort Tech in the Bay of Plenty, not Hort Tech as a national strategy, not Hort Tech in developing another paper, but rather Hort Tech that quite naturally is embedded in a particular region. It's not just in New Zealand that clusters are on the agenda. What I see particularly in Europe, but also in Canada, and I'll take you to Australia in a moment, is much more realization that clusters provide a very active framework, a very practical framework to engage in recovery. A lot of support coming from the European Commission. One of their websites, COVID-19, Connect, Solve, Address. But it's not just at the Brussels level, it's not just at the national level, many regions across Europe. And highlighting here Catalonia in Spain, and Catalonia has had a cluster program now for almost 3 decades. And within a month of COVID arriving in Barcelona, many of their clusters were quickly up to speed in finding responses, addressing, minimizing, in a way turning adversity into advantage. Their fashion cluster, their lighting cluster, their kids cluster, helping people now engage more fully at home as home life changed. It's not just in Europe. Let me take you to somewhere else. I want to take you to a camel farm. And it's actually a camel farm on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And there's a clustering initiative there called FAN, Food and Agribusiness Network. It's an initiative that particularly brings together some 325 businesses, and businesses that at times compete, but also are exploring where might we collaborate. One of the early ways in which collaboration developed here with the arrival of COVID-19 was collaboration amongst food producers that were particularly focused on restaurants, suddenly had their market cut off and needed to readjust, needed to repackage, needed to reorientate their food products to meet a retail need. So sharing with you here a group and a cluster hunting as a pack, and in part able to hunt as a pack because there's quite a bit of trust amongst them. It's not just the businesses that are part of this cluster, it's also vocational training, it's universities, and for Australia there really is a clutter of government agencies, the local, the state and the federal, and often not that easy to align this clutter of government support. What is the purpose of this initiative? Fundamentally, it's about removing silos. It's about connection. It's about promotion. It's about business development within the region, in the Brisbane market, but also increasingly internationally, developing the Malaysian market, the Singapore market, the Shanghai market. It's not a big organization that is running this cluster. There's no full-time person. Emma is half-time as the general manager of the cluster, and 3 other people that typically put in 2 days a week. It's a voluntary board, an elected board. The chairperson, Jackie, is an ex-McKinsey consultant who's relocated, semi-retired to Queensland, and is putting in voluntary time to help make this happen. Part of what they're doing now, as COVID is moving through, that they're able to meet again, it's a monthly meetup at different places. And a monthly meetup that in part helps build the social fabric, helps people know who is who amongst the 300 odd organizations that are part of this cluster, but also helps identify where might there be other collaborative agendas. I've taken you into one food cluster in Queensland. I could have taken you into a similar one in Gippsland, a fermentation technology cluster in Tasmania. 3 Aussie clusters that are supported by a Callaghan funded type organization, Food Innovation Australia. And like the way they highlight clustering, it's about growth. It's about working together. I could also have taken you into other places in Australia, in Colorado. Food Island is in Prince Edward Island, Canada, a cluster I visited 2-3 times. I could have taken you to Lithuania. I could have taken you to Wales, the Welsh food cluster at the bottom here in southern Sweden, Skåne. I could have taken you to Food Valley around Wageningen University in Holland. Each of these are clusters that at times compete with each other, but also are able to work through where might we collaborate, where might we draw on each other's activities, where might we support our businesses in moving internationally. And a question for our regional food clusters across New Zealand is, what are our points of difference? And how do we better engage as a team, as that team is doing on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and as these other teams that I'm describing on this slide are doing? People hunting as a pack, competing, at times competing fiercely, but able to work through where are their common agendas. One of the initiatives coming through right now in Europe is a global cluster matchmaking. It's online. It's an opportunity, particularly for cluster managers around the world, to tap into other clusters that may be relevant. Perhaps a food cluster in Australia, tapping into a food packaging cluster in southern Sweden, or another food packaging cluster in Austria that is focusing on biodegradable plastics. And seeing around the world many meetups such as this, some online, and hopefully we'll be back to eyeballing before too long, face to face. But at the moment, we're not structured in New Zealand to really participate in these types of meetups. Dolly has a neat phrase: find out who you are and do it on purpose. And the places I've just taken you to, the food places, are working through who are we? What is our niche? What are our specializations? And then with purpose, engaging around that specialization. Let me take you to southern Norway and some commonalities here with Taranaki. This was an offshore service center for the North Sea. It was multi-purpose. And then over time, found what we're actually good at doing is subsea drilling. That's our core specialization, excuse the pun, our deep specialization. Some 70 companies, hunting as a pack, exploring. Nobody's invented this cluster, it's come naturally, but there is now a clustering initiative which has 10-year support from the Norwegian government. And it's a clustering initiative that is in part bringing people together around projects within their core markets, such as robotics, such as composites, but it is also deliberately exploring diversification with the competencies that we've got. Can we take those? How do we take them? How do we migrate them into offshore wind, subsea mining, aquaculture, geothermal energy? And see many clustering initiatives around the world, like this one in Norway, engaged in upgrading their competitiveness, upgrading their productivity, but also deliberately exploring where do we take our skills elsewhere? And in any region, diversification often grows, or typically grows, from existing strengths. And that's what this team in Norway is doing. And it's what each of these dots up and down Norway are doing, each centered on a regional specialization, a point of difference, bringing together the local team and then engaging across Scandinavia, across the world in many cases. I mentioned the European Commission as I started. Strong support from the European Commission for cluster development. Some 2,500 clusters have been identified across Europe. And a key number coming up here, it's 1 in 3 jobs, but it's over half of Europe's wage bill. So saying in any community, it's in our strong clusters that we particularly find the high value jobs. A lot of work has been done over the last decade in understanding what's the payoff for a company in participating in a clustering initiative? What's the payoff for a public agency in supporting clustering? And one of the pieces of evidence coming through from Denmark here is particularly focusing on how clusters help small businesses engage globally. Again, small businesses not exploring individually, but understanding where do we hunt as a pack to develop new markets, perhaps far away from our home base. You may be familiar with Charles Landry's work, like the way in which here talking about cities of ambition, but the title could equally be regions of ambition. He's highlighting first, identify and orchestrate around your unique resources. Work through what you're good at doing. Work through what you're darn good at doing in your region, and then engage around that. Work through what are the key activities that are pulling wealth into your region, be it from elsewhere in New Zealand or internationally. Understanding the traded side of your local economy. There's another leg here too that Landry neatly focuses. The importance of a startup culture. Let me use Iceland as my example here. I've been to this incubator 2-3 times. It's not a multi-purpose incubator that is particularly for oceans-related companies. The last time I was there, there was one company looking at taking cod liver oil and extracting high-value nutraceuticals from that. Another company looking at automating long lines, putting bait onto long lines. Another company taking fish skins and preparing those fish skins for Hermes handbags. So it's a startup incubator, but 50, 60 startup companies here, all of them are marine related, ocean related. And many of the best incubators, the most effective incubators that I see around the world, have got a focus, particularly on the traded side, on the specializations of that community. What I'm seeing in Iceland, what I'm seeing in Sweden, what I'm seeing in these other places is an acceptance that, hey, we can't do this flying solo. It is collaboration amongst diverse participants, finding ways to row in the same boat, in the same direction together. There's a bit of fresh air coming in to our thinking in New Zealand right now. And I sense the minister was referring to this too. David Skilling, ex-Treasury, now an independent consultant, has been asked by the Productivity Commission to take a look at why do we have so few frontier firms relative to other small advanced economies? Frontier firms like Gallagher, like Weta. Why do we have so few of these? Particularly so few relative to countries such as Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden. And in exploring this, David Skilling's response is, firms at the productivity frontier tend to operate in deep clusters. They're not flying solo. They're located in ecosystems, perhaps ecosystems that include their competitors and they put heat on each other, but ecosystems that includes specialized training, specialized knowledge flows. The skilled labor is there. Backwards linkages, supply chain linkages, forward linkages, specialist advisory services, whether it's legal services, Callahan type services, NZTE services. So services that are particularly aligned around the needs of those clusters. The Productivity Commission has been asking for submissions. Let me share with you one point that I made in my submission. And happy to send any of you my submission. It is indeed on the Productivity Commission's website. One point I make is empowering our regions in New Zealand through the economic development agencies to systematically build on their specializations, on the regional specializations, saying we need to empower, we need to resource our regions rather than support being drip fed from a clutter of national agencies. And unfortunately, what we do have is a clutter relative to what I see in the other countries that David Skilling has looked at, what I see in places like Sweden, what I see in Norway, what I see in Denmark, in Austria, other small economies that are outperforming us. As I finish, let me draw on Einstein. And I like his focus. There's opportunities in crisis because there's change. My final slide here. Encourage you in your region. Identify your growth nodes, your clusters, your smart specializations. Call them what you will. It doesn't really matter what you call them. Certainly clusters is the international term that is used and is accepted around the world. Use your convening power. Pam Ford used this term a couple of times during these webinars, and it's a neat point. EDAs have got a neutral convening power, and suggesting here, use this particularly to invite related businesses around your table. And I'm thinking of the lead firms in the traded economy, the lead firms that are pulling wealth into your region. And as I look at all the firms in any region, Nelson, my home region, wherever it might be, often 2/3 or so of firms are servicing the local market. It's 1/3 that are pulling in wealth, and that's the starting point. And many of these lead firms are possibly not coming to knock on the door to ask for a $5,000 grant. They're big enough, in a sense, ugly enough. But these are the firms that often have got common issues, common roadblocks, common opportunities. Encourage you by working with groups of firms. Leave your time, moving from a retail relationship individually to a more wholesale relationship. from your knowledge of the needs of those firms, from the discussion around your table. Quickly identify collaborative agendas and engage. And I suspect part of those collaborative agendas will be aligning support services around real business needs. As I finish, I'm describing EDAs. EDAs as connectors, EDAs as specialization enhancers, and encourage you, as you're thinking about transformation in your region, as hopefully you're thinking about, yes, we've got to respond, and we've got to respond to the immediate crises. We've got to find mechanisms to do that. Please also find time to think through how can we be more proactive as a connector, particularly amongst the lead firms on the traded side. How can we dig deeper? How can we better understand the issues facing groups of firms within the specializations that we have within our community? Thank you, Patrick. That's where I wanted to get to.
Great, thanks Ifor, that we had enough time to let you get through that, and thanks to everybody for staying online for a few extra moments before the break. We have got time for a couple of quick questions, I think, before we break for the lunch slot. And so there's a couple that have been asked, and I'll also kind of pick a few themes up. So first one is you talked, and you talked actually, you mentioned this earlier actually as well in one of your questions about the need to empower the regions in terms of actually moving forward. But you also, in some of your examples, you talked about some of the strong national support that was available in places like Sweden, etc. And then obviously we heard about the minister talking for the first time about, you know, the industry transformation and the kind of role of cluster development. In your experience, what do you think the sort of right balance is between the right sort of national policy settings, national framework for supporting these types of outcomes, and then what gets picked up and owned and moved forward by the region? So in a period where government is looking at future of PGF, future of, you know, the industry transformation, what would your advice be back both to national government and to the regions in terms of how to get the balance right?
Neat one, Patrick. We are the most capital-centric of all the OECD countries. Wellington calls the shots, and calls the shots disproportionately. And what I'm seeing in places like Norway, places like Austria, Denmark, Sweden, I'm seeing much more comfort share by national governments in saying, hey, we can't micromanage from the capital city. We need to empower you guys in the locality. You need to work through, you need to integrate training and export development and what's happening in the school system and what's happening with export support. You need to fine tune that. These other places are much more comfortable in taking a more granular approach. Canada has gone big time with $1 million. Let me get the decimal point in the right place. $1 billion was offered in a competition to 5 clusters. It was $1 billion co-funding. Each of these, the winners, has got a kitty of around 300 million over 5 years with co-funding. And I've heard the minister in Ottawa say to them, don't ask me what you should be doing with the money. Tell me how you're using it. Tell me what you've done with it. So comfortable with empowering, and we're not comfortable yet. And it is difficult to align from head office to align from Wellington. The export support, the science and technology activities, the role of universities, the role of EDAs. And what I'm seeing elsewhere is much more bottom up. And I wish, instead of talking about industry transformation plans, we were talking about regional transformation plans. And then Wellington, picking up from each of those regional transformation plans, what are the common issues? And again, a comfort share elsewhere in seeing economic development much more bottom up. We're still top down, but I like the way the minister this morning was talking about a more granular approach, a more bottoms up approach.
And stronger partnership with the EDAs. The next question I'd have, Ifor, which has come through as well, is so the sort of issue, I guess, around resilience and diversification within regional economies as well. So there's a question about if we think about the global impact of an event like COVID-19 and how it has the ability to significantly impact in this instance, entire kind of clusters. So particularly if you think about some of the tourism-based kind of clusters and areas of specialization. Do you think how do you balance that sort of specialization as a tool for empowering innovation and growth and all of those things that it can achieve, and building in a degree of resilience into your economy so you're not reliant on kind of just one or two main sectors?
Good one, Patrick, and neat to hear from Queenstown, from Peter Harris. Yesterday, day before, forget when it was, talking about, yes, it's tourism, but actually now there's even more pressure on diversification. And in part what he was talking about was related diversification that has grown out of our specialization in tourism. You had a webinar a week or so ago that included Iceland and their tourism cluster. And I like the way they defined their tourism cluster in saying, yes, it's destination marketing, it's destination management, but it's more than that, because the tourism cluster also includes the food suppliers, it's the logistics, it's the different government agencies, it's the airports, it's the whole system. So taking a cluster approach often enables us or helps us in extending our thinking to understanding what are the ecosystem impediments, what are the issues, what are the opportunities at a higher level.
And then final question from me, which is again sort of linked to some of the things coming through. So if we think about the sort of sustainability of a cluster over time, you know better than me that some governments have invested from time to time in cluster-based initiatives and then have moved away from them. And how do you kind of build a system that's kind of less reliant on the kind of, I guess, the whims of government policy to actually set up this sort of sustainable mechanism for supporting clusters through time? And I guess an ancillary but sort of related question is, of those areas that you have knowledge of and have experienced, where there's been a continual investment and commitment to this agenda, can we look back and actually see the longer term impact that's been achieved by a sustained focus on cluster development?
Good one, Patrick. You've got short questions and it's difficult to have it come in with a short. Firstly, a cluster is not a static concept. At the boundaries of any cluster, there will be new things happening. So at the boundaries of the Barossa wine cluster, new forms of wine packaging were developed. The bag-in-the-box for wine, that was then almost a new cluster started at the fringes. But there is now a lot of evidence that's been accumulated over 15, 20 years, particularly from Europe, on the effectiveness of cluster interventions. It is still an art to measure the impact. You can't measure the ROI. But one of the key disciplines, as I described in Canada, is co-funding. It shouldn't be a public agency totally funding a clustering initiative. Businesses should have some skin in it, and perhaps other public agencies, perhaps universities, training organizations, industry associations should also be co-funders, co-participants in a sustainable clustering initiative.
Very good. Ifor, thank you very much for your insights as always. I know that there's been quite a few points across the last couple of days where you've also kind of chimed in with good kind of questions for the speakers as well. So it's been great to have your support and input for the conference. We are going to take a break now and we are due back on with Joseph Stewart at 1 p.m. Where we're going to be talking about the sort of notion of economic gardening, growing your own, which also has a relationship through to some of the sort of around specialization clusters. So everybody, thanks for joining us this morning. I hope you found the sessions useful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you all again at 1 o'clock. Thanks. You had a good lunch. Sorry, we're a few moments late. We were just getting everything sorted at this end. It's great to have you back. I hope you enjoyed this morning's sessions. We've got another 2 sessions in the program today. The first of which is around economic gardening and developing your entrepreneurial sort of ecosystem. And the speaker for this session will be Joseph Stewart, who I'm sure many of you know. Joseph's the GM for Business Innovation and Growth at Northland Inc. He's also a regular contributor to the EDNZ World of Learning. I'm going to pass over to Joseph in a moment, and usual sort of protocols apply. If you can use the chat function for any questions, you can keep your mic and your cameras off, and then I'll pull together some of the themes. And as I said to Joseph earlier, I'll put my camera back on as we're coming towards the end of this session, which is a 5-minute countdown, so that we can ask some questions, etc. So Joseph, nice to see you again. Welcome to
Thanks,
Congress.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think we're midway through the Congress, so starting the slide at the end of it, so very pleased to be able to talk you through a concept of economic gardening and how it can be useful to support communities to engage and strengthen as we move forward. A little bit about me. I'm not going to labour on that slide. I feel like I've been doing this for a very long time, but I'm very passionate about growing entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial communities, and seeing people be inspired and create aspiration for others. So just going to run through quickly economic gardening. What is the concept? How does it work? How can economic development agencies support the delivery of a program? Having a think about who our first customers are and how you would engage a process to look at creating an economic gardening strategy. When we're thinking about economic gardening, we're thinking about an endogenous approach where we're looking to grow our local community. So this isn't about business attraction or bringing new entrepreneurs or new businesses into the region. It's around strengthening the connections and the entrepreneurial activity that is already happening within your community. The concept was born in 1987 in Littleton, Colorado by a gentleman named Chris Gibbons. And he started looking at how can he support communities within his communities to start working together. And through the process of a very short period of time, he doubled the number of active jobs in the community from 15 to 30,000 over about 3 years. It was really impressive. From a New Zealand perspective, we haven't seen an economic gardening program, a formal economic gardening program, but I'm sure when you reflect on your own communities, once we've gone through this slide deck, you'll have some thoughts or some ideas of where economic gardening is already happening, maybe informally. And what I've seen in the news and the activities as we've gone through 2019 is that COVID has supported an economic gardening renaissance in some respects, where people are starting to work local, act local, and I'm sure you all heard the buy local messages really, really loudly. And now what this concept or methodology looks at is actually trying to formalise and put some structure around that to allow progression and to allow the growth in jobs in the communities to occur. It's a decentralised activity. It's really hard to centralise the delivery of an economic gardening program. And when we start thinking through the wins for a program or any exemplars of what has actually occurred, they happen at a real micro or SME level. So the maturity of an economic gardening program ends up in a growing ecosystem and potentially into cluster programs as they mature and come through their sophistication levels. It's an important approach. As I said, it increases collaboration. It really is an ecosystem approach. Looking at economic gardening, what we're thinking around is the value chain of activity around a business and looking at vertical integration rather than horizontal. So in most respects, it's around how do we shorten the value chains of businesses and allow producers of goods or services to get direct to customer as quickly as possible at whatever scale is required for each community. And as I mentioned just before, this is really at the micro SME level. It's not at a large corporate end of town. And really what it builds is diversity in a local community, and it builds strength across the value chain by having more engagement at a local level and more density around those activities. So how does it work? It's focused on SME businesses, it's focused on businesses in your community, and it's not a strategic activity as such. It's more around doing. and delivering activity around strategy, marketing and finance. It's not a consulting gig. It's not fly in, drop a bit of paper, fly out. It takes time and commitment to support our communities to work through. It's a flexible methodology, and each community will be different in the way they come together and the way they work. The support that we need to provide or can be provided to support an economic gardening program is not financial. It's really around people and networks and relationships, and then the data and information that come out of that. A lot of the basis of what looks like really solid economic gardening programs comes down to a concept that Ifor may have talked to you about earlier this morning, and that's shoe leather. And that's meeting people, understanding their requirements, understanding where their pain points are, and in some respects, understanding where there are high transaction costs, where the local community can come together to remove those high transactions costs. Our role, or the role of economic development in supporting the delivery of an economic gardening program, is really to provide the information to businesses to help them survive and thrive. Now that can be a number of different levels of information. It could be GIS maps, it could be soil maps of the community, it could be stronger relationships with distribution companies, and could be a whole lot of different activities depending on the community. And it's beyond just the physical transactional or financial capital or the physical capital. It's really around a community that is looking to move forward and thrive. And that cultural aspect is very, very important. And obviously, when we're thinking around supporting and growing or attracting or the growth of our local communities, it's the people within it that are really, really important. So it's a role of an economic gardening program will galvanise and connect and create that additional collaboration between people, which then when the needs of that community or those businesses drop out, those connections then will support greater engagement and more sophistication of activity. The connections component is components, and I'm sure all of you are aware of the triple helix and the relationships between business, academic and public sector, and what that looks like and how we can support as a collective community, all focused in the same direction, a local environment to progress. While I'm talking about this local, I mean, definitions of local are an interesting activity. It could be at a district or a TA level, it could be at a small community-based level. But what I've found when we've been looking through the research for this program is that the further you are from a metro, these programs seem to be more successful. But then when you look internationally, especially in the US where this program's been going for 17 odd years, you look into communities within larger cities, and those communities themselves have built really strong local economic gardening activity that strengthens and provides a buzz for that local community within the wider city. So the support or strength of a local community and the way they come together is really, really important. There's a question around how well do you know your customers in your area? I'm sure we've got a good understanding of some of the demographics and the metros for the communities that you're in, but it's really starting to get under the hood and start looking at, are there areas of density or are there areas of aggregation in any of your demographics? So I know from my region that we have a strong primary sector and primarily into our four-legged animals, our wet and dry beef, and our growing horticulture. When I look at the demographics of people coming through the RBP process, we see a lot of retail and a lot of construction businesses, which again match the demographics at a high level of our region. And I'm sure you understand the breakdown of your own demographics in your own regions. Within that, though, there are key players and key businesses. And are they engaged? Are they prepared to give back? There may be financial benefit in an economic gardening program, but I would suggest that's an outcome rather than an output of an economic gardening program. The output is more around the collaboration and the working together. Getting the key players to come together and to start thinking through what they collectively need, what the approach they should be taking, what kind of messaging, what kind of branding, what kind of support mechanisms, what kind of leverage that community should be thinking through to help themselves to move forward is a really important component. And obviously the key players, in whichever way they organise themselves, it can be formal, it can be informal, are very important functions within that. And then as we start getting through an economic gardening program and looking at the delivery of it, starting to think through Is there a cluster potential here? Is there any cluster sophistication? Either a horizontal or a vertical, and say ideally it would be vertical, but either way, is there some way that we can start getting some reduction of transaction costs and support for a number of companies working together in a cluster right across the value chain from the research through to the customer end? And then obviously at the next level of sophistication, we start then looking at smart specialization areas within that where there is some function or group of functions that are working together across that value chain, which are unique and can provide some sort of flag to raise up the pole and say, this is what we do, we do it really, really well, we are the best in the world at doing this sort of activity. Outcome of this, and it really is a starting point for thinking through an economic gardening, is thinking through how well have you, or how far have you got in ecosystem mapping your current community, whether that be at a regional or a local level. There are other programs in the world of learning where you can start thinking through ecosystem development, and I know a number of you are working really hard at ecosystem development on a number of different factors, either on demand or supply of IP, and how that works through. But it's really important to start thinking through what is the actual, what are the inputs that you are going to be putting into an economic gardening system when primarily it's the people that are the key components. That target market assessment is really important if you are preparing for a strategy. It can be really complicated. There's a lot of different factors. Every community will be unique. Every person is unique. So therefore their approach or their take on an activity needs to be thought through, brought in, collaboration needs to occur. There needs to be buy-in on a number of different levels, both on the public sector, as they all support amenities, roads, infrastructure, potential funding, and that public buy-in is really, really important. But you also need the community and the private sectors to buy in to support it. And it needs to be an all-of-place kind of approach, which is complicated and difficult and time-consuming. So to engage the willing is really, really important. Economic gardening is a medium to long-term game. It is not a 3-year cycle. Most of these programs, as I look through the research and think through how they would be delivered, we're looking at a 10 to 20 year time frame. So if I reflect back on economic gardening as a concept and a methodology is 17 years old, and there are some good wins in that first decade, and now we're in the second decade of the program, there appears to be a really strong grassroots element here that can really galvanise the community to move forward. Without that ongoing support and commitment to a program, obviously things die and wither, and then as the curse of the public sector, when we get some more energy and engagement, we come firing back in 3 or 4 years later and say, woohoo, we're ready to go again. There is a challenge there in re-engagement, especially with our private sector who have longer memories than potentially the public sector. So it's really important to ensure that when you're looking at an economic gardening program, you have a view for 10 years outside political cycles. And ideally that's funded in such a way that can support that longevity of the program. Thinking through the next steps, we start thinking through, okay, so we've got a group of people who want to work together, they're thinking it from a long-term point of view. There's a bit of pootier potentially on the table to support some resourcing, there's a bit of availability in and around that. Then the next stage is thinking through what is actually required, what does our community actually require to help them to grow. An example of this, which we're running out here in the Northern region at the moment, is the Kaipara Kai and Kaipara Kai Hub program, funded through PGF. Delivered by KDC, Kaipara District Council, and supported by Northern Link. That program provides a whole lot of data at a high level on land atmospheric opportunities for Kaipara. It also has a study that looks at different crop types and how they would fare within that community, that macro data. And then we've got the hub itself with people who are then engaging and sharing, developing that information. It has the hallmarks of a good start for an economic gardening program. I guess my one challenge when I think through that program is the longevity and the long-term game here. PGF is a short-term tool, so we're working really hard with our team to think through, okay, so if this is the start of economic gardening program and we're in Kai, which is kind of nice, how do we get longevity in this program and support our community to grow, primarily in horticulture, primarily in Kaipara? This is an intro. I'm very lucky and very proud to deliver as part of the World of Learning for Economic Development and support the delivery of the ACED program. There is an economic gardening program as part of that. It's one of the elected papers, And in that paper over 2 sessions, I was taking you through how to build a gardening strategy, how to have a stronger diagnostic lens on what you've actually got in your regional economy, having to look through the flexible methodology and what it could actually work for you. And then, of course, there's the peer-to-peer learning and what that looks like with your others. You can find out more of the World Learning Economic Development. I'm sure you guys all know what that is. And I look forward to talking through you then. But I've rattled through this really, really quickly. So Patrick, I'm up for questions if there are any.
That's thank you very much, Joseph. That's good going, saying that, because last time I think you said it took about an hour to deliver it all, so you've done a great job to get through that. And there's some good sort of connection to some of the other themes that have come out in some of the recent sessions. And I guess first question I'd probably ask you here is, obviously you've got a lot of experience of the Regional Business Partners Programme, and will obviously be close to the additional investment that's being put into that programme to kind of respond to and kind of scale up response to COVID-19. But as a programme, the Regional Business Partner Programme only really deals with a certain amount of business support. And given some of the things that you're saying around sort of economic gardening, and if we're looking forward into, you know, a new term, a new kind of government, what are some of the things that you believe we might more systematically incorporate into our approach to business support in the regions that incorporates things like economic gardening, but could work alongside whatever RBP looks like in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. The RBP service has responded phenomenally. I'm going to suggest this year we've been doing a year's business every month since April, and it's created additional stress. And of the businesses that we've seen come through in our region, more than 50% of them are new to RBP, haven't engaged with us before. And that's given us a really rich and stronger data set in understanding our regional local economy and where our, I guess if I come back to this question around demographics, understanding a better makeup at a more tactical level than the Stats New Zealand demographics for our region. So we've got a really stronger understanding of our data sets. The RBP is a transactional tool, and it's a one-to-one for a business to remove a problem. Where there's a challenge or potentially where there's an opportunity moving forward is in that one-to-many activity. So how do you support a group of companies to start working together? We have funds to support businesses, but we don't have funds to support clusters or gardening programs as they would be. When you look to Europe, I'm sure Ifor has been very eloquent in his expression of this. You know, they've got a decade or longer in their funding for their program, so they can actually get some traction and get some activity happening. And when I think about one-to-many and I start thinking around the way our value chains in our communities are built, both vertically and horizontally from a business community point of view, what's or who's actually supporting that? I don't think we have many sector programs in our RDAs. I know we have some in areas of density. From my region, F&B, which encompasses all horticulture, agriculture, essentially at a fine point. We've got some strength happening in there, but there's no formal funding on the table to support those activities. So it comes out of love. So therefore it's not sustainable. So thinking through program delivery for one-to-many and how we can support better one-to-many programs at a regional/national level is something that I would suggest really needs to be looked at. And obviously what that will do is in the top of pipe we'll have a lot more local-based activities where we can start seeing some really diverse specialisation happening around New Zealand.
That's good, helpful. And then the other thing I was going to ask is, so you talk about how this has real value when you're working with some of those kind of micro businesses, and you talked about particularly sort of outside of some of the metropolitan areas, although obviously within every metropolitan area you get quite sort of small pockets of businesses as well. But you also talked about value chains. So is there anything more you can say about the relationship in an economic gardening program between those small micro businesses that you're engaging with and how they relate to larger frontier firms, you know, key employers in any locality, and how does the model sort of support those connectivity?
Well, I think, well, for one, it creates an opportunity for connectivity. You'll note that especially at the beyond SME level into the corporate end of town, they're pretty good at getting together, they're pretty good at talking with each other, they've got a really strong understanding and influence in the way they do their business, both at the regional and national level. When we're looking at the economic gardening program, people don't have those connections or that capability. And really it's around connections. So if we start thinking through, you don't know what you don't know, or you don't know who you don't know. The Economic Gardening Program provides a platform to bring people together to actually start getting those voices around the table and an understanding of the requirements that will then support engagement with the more formalised groups. So what I see is, I see it every day, and I think it's a privilege that we have as economic developers in the roles we play, is that we are privileged to meet a heap of people from all sides and walks and spectrums, and a big value add of us in our role is the fact we know lots of people. So we can plug people in really quickly into either you're looking for that kind of business or that kind of supplier or that kind of market. We know the right people. So we, in some respects, are the connectors, and we can connect people in. The Economic Gardening Program shares that love into a group of people in the community who can then also support that connecting. I think that the relationships that you can bring to an Economic Gardening Program, and how you can support people within a program with the relationships and the people you know to help them nurture and grow, is really important.
Good. And then final question, which probably brings us back to something we were talking about almost just before the webinar started, where we were referring to that sort of difference between vertical and horizontal alignment for a cluster. And this is quite relevant to some of the conversations we've been having earlier, and be just useful to get your perspective on that as well.
So I think with an Economic Gardening Program, we're really looking down a value chain. So we're looking vertically or across a value chain, but a vertical integration of some kind, and supporting a reduction in transaction across there, and some levels of aggregation or density across the value chain to make it work better and make it reduce the transaction costs from production through to consumer. And I think that's really important that we start thinking through that when we look at cluster programs as they are imagined and in some respects delivered. You see a lot of horizontal clusters, businesses all really in the same stage, and then you see others that are really good examples of splintering up the product sets so that they are vertically integrated. And when we think around, is it a horizontal or vertical integration for a cluster, it's a really important question, because every cluster is different and has different components to it and different makeups to it, as every economic gardening program will do. So the methodology needs to be quite flexible, and it needs, again, like a program like this, it needs ongoing funding to support sophistication to be developed. Flash in the pan, here one day, we've gone the other, is no good. In personal experience, I turned up here 6 years ago in Northland, loved every moment of it. And saw some work that had happened in the region in 2006. So I picked it up and went, this is amazing. I'm going to dust this off and I'm going to go again. And I had the first 5 businesses I engaged with who were engaged in the first program tell me to piss off, because there was no longevity and it had been dropped. They got promised the world, funding stopped, EDA disappeared. I come up a decade later and say, hey, let's have another go. And they go, you dropped us last time, we'll probably do it again. So that long-term funding is a real key requirement that, given the governance and ownership structures in most of the entities in the ED world, is always going to be a challenge, unless there is some other mechanism that we can look to decade-long funding programs.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message about how the sort of, economic development's a process. It's not just a one-off intervention. You need to kind of keep consistently engaged to get those benefits. Joseph, that's excellent. I know that this is a course that can also be sort of accessed through World of Learning as well. So as with some of the advice that Ifor was giving earlier as well. So thank you very much for your time today. And good to see you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks all. I hope you found that useful. Email address there. Happy to take any queries.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Enjoy this afternoon.
Great. So we've got one more session left this afternoon. So that will take us to the end of day 3. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Hayes, Senior Economist from Infometrics. Many of you will be familiar with the work that Infometrics do, and obviously we heard earlier in the week from kind of Brad as well. So it's great to have the support of Infometrics for these 2 sessions through the conference, and something which is probably dear to a number of our hearts at the moment, the issues around sort of skills demand and supply, important issues about relationships between that, regional skills leadership groups, etc. So Rob's going to speak to us about some of Infometrics work and kind of expertise in this area as well. So Rob, nice to see you online, and over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to share my screen with you because I've got a presentation to run through. I think that's it. There we go. Okay, yeah, so I'm Rob Hayes. I'm a senior economist at Infometrics Economics Consultancy. I'm going to talk to you today about our current forecasts for where the New Zealand economy is headed for the next 5 or so years. Obviously, COVID-19 has been at the forefront of our minds for the past few months, so we'll talk through what we think are the implications for the pandemic on New Zealand. And then I'm going to get into an area of work which I'm calling it's a work in progress at the moment. We're building a framework that will allow us to try and understand better that kind of matching of skills supply from sources like immigration and tertiary education with the skills that are in demand in the economy, particularly 2 or 3 years out from now, once the economic recovery begins. As I say, it's a work in progress for us. I'll remind you a little bit when I start talking about it, but the numbers themselves are probably not the most important thing at the moment. It's more the way we're bringing different data sets together and how we're analysing those different data sets to give us metrics that we need to understand supply and demand for skills. But more on that later. Let's talk about the economic outlook for New Zealand. Infometrics has been forecasting the economy for something like 20 odd, maybe even 30 years. And we've got 3 main models. We've got our national macroeconomic forecasting framework, which was developed by our chief forecaster, Gareth Keenan. And it simulates the relationship between different sectors of the economy, the labour market, businesses, households, government, etc. It projects out 5 years out to 2025, and it forecasts a number of economic, macroeconomic variables such as unemployment, employment, interest rates, exchange rates, etc. We revise those forecasts usually 4 times a year, but we've revised them 2 or 3 times in the past few months because things are changing so quickly. We also have a general equilibrium model, which was developed by our chief economist, Adolf Strombergen. This looks out 30 years and provides forecasts of employment across industries. We use this to simulate different economic shocks. And so we've been using it quite intensively in looking at the effects of COVID-19. We've been able to model the impact of border closures, of lockdown, of the cessation of international tourism, the effects that COVID's having on the global economy, etc. And so that's allowed us to do a really deep dive into the effects of COVID-19, and that's really influenced our forecasts going forward for the next few years at the least. And then we have our regional forecasting model, which takes our national industry forecasts and disaggregates them down to territorial authority level. This is our newest model. It basically creates multiple forecast models for every industry within each TA, and then uses machine learning to choose which of those models has the best predictive ability for each TA industry. So it's a very kind of customized model. A lot of forecasting models just kind of it's to turn the handle and just crank out the numbers, whereas this model it's very specific for each industry within each TA, and it tries to capture the specific dynamics of each industry within each TA. So the other point I'd like to make is that our regional forecasts are always constrained to our national forecasts. So that recognises that regions must compete for a finite pool of labour. We have an industry occupation matrix using census data. We look at how employment within industries is shared across occupations, and this allows us to translate our industry forecasts into occupation forecasts. And we also use census data to create a net replacement demand matrix, which allows us to estimate job openings resulting from people leaving the workforce, so retirees mainly, but also people leaving the workforce for other reasons. So that gives us a much better understanding of what the demand for skills and the demand for labour is going to be in the future. We can look at industries that are expanding or contracting, so that the total number of jobs, but we can add into that this demand for skills that's based upon people needing to be replaced because they've left the workforce. So here's a look at our current view on the national outlook. What you can see here is this dotted green line was our forecast for the size of the economy measured in billions of dollars all the way back in January. This was our January forecast. Seems like an age ago now, doesn't it? And then COVID hit and we've had to revise. As I say, we revised our forecast 2 or 3 times since then. Our latest one was finalized in late July. And you can see we're expecting a sharp decline in the size of the economy this year, partly because of, well, mostly because of lockdown, because of all that economic activity that couldn't happen during lockdown, but also because of the ripple effects of lockdown, with all that money that would have been earned by businesses and workers that was basically taken out of the economy in lockdown. That's going to have the ripple effects on other businesses and other workers, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So a sharp decline in the economy this year, and that's even with all of the money that the government's been putting in with things like the wage subsidy and business support schemes, raising benefit entitlements, etc. It's hard to imagine what things would have looked like without all that government support. And we're picking what we're calling a U-shaped recovery. A lot of other forecasters, including Treasury, are picking what they call a V-shaped recovery, which is a sharp decline followed by a sharp recovery. We expect the recovery to take time. We expect those ripple effects that I talked about to carry on impacting the economy probably out till at least the middle, if not late next year. We're expecting to see job losses to continue rising through next year. And then once we get into 2022 and things, and perhaps 2023, when things start to turn around, we don't think the economy can start creating jobs at the kind of rate that some of the other forecasters think that it can do. So we're picking this U-shaped recovery. So by about 2023, 2024, we think the economy will be back to the size that it was pre-pandemic. But even looking out as far as 2025, it's not going to be at the level that we thought it was going to be back in January. Now, obviously, economic growth translates into job gains or job losses. And so you can see a similar picture emerging here in terms of our forecast for the unemployment rate. Back in January, we thought that unemployment would continue to be around that 4% mark for the foreseeable future. Now we're picking an unemployment rate peaking towards the end of next year at close to 10%. Forecasters such as Treasury think it's going to peak at a similar level actually, but sooner. And Treasury think that the unemployment rate is going to probably decline quicker than we think it will. And then that goes back to that U-shaped recovery that we're picking. With a U-shaped recovery, with a more moderate recovery in economic growth, it's going to take a while for the unemployment rate to get back down. And at the moment, frankly, it's hard to see how we're going to get it back down to something close to 4% as where we were pre-pandemic. Now, what we've seen, some of you might be scratching your heads a little bit if you've seen the latest household labour force survey numbers that came out recently that I think nationally showed a slight decline in unemployment. So what's all the concern about? Why are these economists being so pessimistic? Well, we think that it's only 1 quarter of data, and we think I think in 3 or 4 quarters later, maybe a year from now, we'll have a much better idea of what's happening in the labour market. But our understanding at the moment is that, first of all, businesses are cutting hours or cutting pay rates in an effort to hold on to as many people as possible. But we also think that those people that are losing their jobs, they're leaving the labour force. And this is where we get into some of the technicalities of the household labour force survey. To be classed as unemployed, to be counted as unemployed, you need to be actively seeking work and available for work. And we think that a lot of those people that were surveyed across the June quarter, so that's April, May and June, who'd lost their jobs, probably looked at the labour market during lockdown and said, you know, what's the point? There's going to be no jobs around, at least for a few months. So they decided perhaps not to make themselves available for work and or not to actively seek work. And so they were then classed as not in the labour force. So they weren't showing up in the unemployment statistics. Now that might change in subsequent quarters. If those people begin to think that a recovery is underway, they might enter those unemployment statistics, possibly in great numbers, and that's when we're expecting to see the unemployment rate start to rise. Also, with the cessation of the wage subsidy extension, we're expecting numbers to start rising towards the end of this year. We think that some firms might hold on to their staff over the Christmas period and then take another look at things next year, after which we think job losses could rise again. But just contrast that with what's happening with unemployment benefit recipients, for example. So people signing on for the job seeker support or the COVID income relief payment, where those numbers since about March, there's more, something like 75,000 additional people who have started signing on for those unemployment benefits. So if you're still wondering where all those unemployed people are, they are there. They're signing on for their unemployment benefits, but they're not being classed as unemployed at the moment. So the national outlook for industries, there are different kinds of industries being impacted differently by COVID-19. Some sectors, such as accommodation and food services and retail trade, were hit hard by lockdown. They simply couldn't trade during that time. They continue to be hit by the cessation in international tourism. And we think that as those job losses do start to rise and consumers observe that and start to feel more and more insecure about their own job security and their own financial outlook, that consumer confidence will start to weaken. It's already kind of weak, actually, and that will encourage consumers to stop spending. And so, that ripple effect that I talked about of weaker consumer spending will continue to hit the accommodation and food services and retail trade industries. We know that there was a bounce in spending during the school holidays after lockdown. A lot of Kiwis heard what the government was saying, and they took some domestic holidays. A lot of people were spending money on their DIY projects or home improvement projects, but that seems to just be a temporary bounce, and we think looking out over the next 12 months, it probably won't be sustained. Now, there are sectors like transport, postal and warehousing, professional, scientific, technical services, information, media and telecommunications. We see these as supporting sectors that kind of feed into a lot of other sectors in the economy and support the activity in a lot of other sectors in the economy. And those kind of supporting sectors tend to grow or decline in line with the economy as a whole. So transport, technical services, information, media, we're expecting some declines in those sectors as the economy starts to contract. We also think there are sectors such as primary industries, which we think at the moment are relatively sheltered from COVID-19. New Zealand exports a lot of basic food commodities, the global economy is going to go into recession, but people still got to eat. There may be a shift in the demand for for food away from some of our premium products towards our more kind of basic commodity products. We think that at the moment there's been a shift away from consumption in restaurants to people consuming at home. This is globally because a lot of countries are still kind of in lockdown because of the pandemic. But broadly speaking, we think that our primary exports are going to continue to do okay. And then we've got sectors like construction. Construction was already looking weak even before the pandemic hit. We do hear anecdotally that there's a lot of consent still coming through. Councils are still consenting in large numbers, but we do think that that is a temporary thing. We've already seen that non-residential construction is starting to weaken, and we're expecting construction activity to weaken over the next few years. Even with help from government, its investment in civil construction projects and PGF projects. In the private sector, with business confidence, we think is going to weaken over the next few years. Businesses will start to either put the kibosh on their big investments, or kind of delay big investments in new buildings, new factories, etc. They might delay those investments for a few years until things start to look up a little bit. And the outlook for regions, well, Auckland's our biggest region, so in terms of absolute number of job losses, we're expecting them to be greatest in Auckland. But proportionately, Canterbury and Otago are going to also see quite big declines. We're expecting a 10% decline in employment in Canterbury over the next couple of years, and an 11% decline in Otago. Canterbury was already going to see some declines in employment because it's coming off that Christchurch rebuild. So we're seeing a lot of people in the construction sector moving away from Canterbury to other regions where there's greater work. But you've also got TAs such as Mackenzie District in Canterbury, which are being hit by that cessation of international tourism. And Otago, it's a region of contrast, really. Dunedin seems to be, we think Dunedin's going to be reasonably resilient to the recession over the next couple of years, but Queenstown is expected to struggle for obvious reasons. That cessation in international tourism, but also domestic tourism is going to be, we think, is going to be weak for the next couple of years because of that weakness in consumer confidence. People who are feeling insecure about their job prospects are going to shy away from what we call discretionary spending, so spending on holidays. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have to consider that the demand for labour comes from not just industries or occupations growing or declining, but those vacancies that occur because people leave the workforce. And this is what I'm trying to demonstrate here by looking across occupation groups. You can see the blue bars on the left are the job losses that we're expecting to see over the next couple of years. The orange bars give you a sense of, in normal times at least, the number of people that would be expected to leave these occupations and leave the workforce in any given over the course of a given year. And you can see that in some occupations like professionals and labourers, our estimate is that those number of replacement vacancies actually outnumber the number of jobs that are going to be lost because of the economic contraction. So we think even over the next couple of years, there might be some pockets of the economy where there will be job opportunities for people. And then translating this, those job openings into qualification demand. And this is where we start to get into trying to estimate the demand for skills. Now, I'll be quite upfront about this. It's very hard to estimate demand for skills. We tend to use qualifications as a proxy for skills. It's an imperfect proxy, we understand that, but measuring actual skills is something that labour market economists have been trying to do for quite a number of years, with varying degrees of success. But what we do is we use the ANSCO classification to translate occupations into skill levels and qualification levels. So that's part of the Australian New Zealand standard classification of occupations. Each occupation has a skill level and a qualification level attached to it. And then we use census data. We look at the census and we say, okay, for the people employed in a given occupation at with the qualification levels prescripted by ANSCO, what is the breadth, what are the fields of study that those people have qualified in? And so using that information, we're able to translate those job opening numbers into demand for qualifications by level and field of study. And so this is what things are looking like over the next couple of years. You can see the standout there is there's going to be great demand, we think, for health occupations and health qualifications. That's mostly nurses, medical professionals, and some health support occupations. There's also a bit of demand for job openings I'll just kind of skip back to that previous slide. You can see there might be some demand for labourers, and those kinds of jobs tend to have quite a breadth of different qualifications. But there's a bit of a pocket there in terms of agriculture. So a lot of people who complete agricultural qualifications often end up in labouring jobs. But as I say, the kind of the real spike in demand at the moment that we're expecting over the next couple of years is in those health qualifications. But I think, as well as kind of thinking about the numbers here, I just want you to kind of understand how we take our forecasts of employment and then try and translate that into some kind of a picture of the demand for skills. I'll come back to tertiary education in a moment, but as we start to build our picture of the supply of skills, and this is that kind of work in progress project that we have going on at the moment. So one of the key sources we try and look at is migrants, and we use data that MB publishes on work visa approvals, where there's an occupation and a region attached to that visa. And that's mostly essential skills visas, actually. We also look at residence visas that have occupations and regions attached to them. And we take account of the fact that quite a number of people who have a residence, who go onto a residence visa, were previously on a work visa, and we try and kind of split those people out. So what we're trying to do basically is to look at migrants who are coming into the labour market new, either on a work visa or on a residence visa, and where possible we try and specify the kinds of occupations those people are doing and the regions that they're working in. Now this data, it admittedly does omit a lot of people who are coming into New Zealand to work, particularly people who are on work visas, but it's a partner visa, so partner of an essential skills visa holder or something like that. Unfortunately, there is a lot of work visas and some residence visas where there isn't any occupation or regional information attached to it, and in that case, we're kind of flying blind. But here's just to give you another perspective on what we can do with these work visa migrants. Here I've taken those work visa migrants that have got technicians and trade worker occupations attached to their visa, and looked at where they're going to be working regionally, compared with work visa migrants across all occupations. You get some interesting conclusions here. You can see that Auckland has about 50% of people coming in on work visas that have a technician and trade worker occupation attached to it. In the last 3 to 4 years, 50% of them went to work in Auckland, for example, compared with just over 40% of work visa holders across all occupations. And then getting back to tertiary education completions, we've been working with the Tertiary Education Commission on a customised data set that tries to pinpoint the substantive qualification that graduates are bringing to the market. And when I say substantive, what I mean is we're trying, there's quite a number of graduates have often done what we call staircasing, where they might have come in, got a level 3 qualification, transitioned to a level 4, perhaps a level 5 or a level 6, and have finally completed their studies when they've done that level 6 and entered the labour market. So we try and kind of knock out the completions that they did at those lower levels and just count their completions in the highest qualification. We know that some people over periods of time do reskill in different fields of study, in different occupations. And so we've tried to count that as well. So if someone graduates in a field of study, say architecture and building at level 7, 10 years ago, we would count that completion in that year. And if last year they decided to go back into tertiary education and do, say, an engineering qualification and come out with a level 7, then we would also count that in that year, because clearly these are people who are perhaps changing their career. So what we try and do is count the number of qualification completions. We can allocate them into fields of study and qualification levels. So we can match this information with that job opening information that I showed you earlier, because they're effectively speaking the same language. They've got completions and job openings by qualification field and qualification level. And the key metric that we try and come up with to understand this is completions per job openings. Now, just a health warning on this, because we've been working with TEC, these are just government subsidised qualifications only, and that's the data that I'm going to be showing you in subsequent slides. But we are working with NZQA to get a data set from them, which will count all completions. So that will include completions by people who have funded their own studies. And I just want to say right from the get-go that what we're trying to do in matching these qualifications to skill demand, we're trying to inform a conversation about skills matching and skills demand. We don't think it's going to be the final word in this conversation. We want it to inform the conversation, but with education and training data, as much as any other kind of data, context is important. It's important to understand the dynamics of the occupations and the sectors that we're focusing on here. And I'll keep reiterating that because it's important. So here's what we've done. So we've taken those job openings by qualification field and qualification level, and we've matched them to qualification completions from tertiary education providers and in industry training, and we've calculated completions per 1,000 job openings. And here, what I've done is looked at completions between 2016 and 18 and job openings between 2023 and 2025. And it gives you a sense of, well, what does the tertiary education system look like now, and how might it need to change in order to better suit the recovery that's going to happen in the economy 2 or 3 years from now. So you can see that this kind of bottom right number over here basically tells us that there's 667 completions per 1,000 job openings. And what I've done in the rest of this table is, if for a given field of study or qualification level, if the number's higher, it's coloured in green. If the number's lower, it's coloured in red. So for example, in agriculture, environmental and related studies, at that kind of level 5 to 7, you've got 344 completions per 1,000 job openings. Contrast that with the same field of study, but at a lower level, level 1 to 3, and you've got over 1,500 completions per job openings. Now, I'm not going to say what what the correct number is for any of these numbers in these cells. It comes back to what I was saying before. You have to understand the dynamics of the industries and the occupations involved in here. We're not trying to say what the right number is, but I think if we kind of share this information with local councils, regional skills leadership groups, etc., they can take it on board and start to have conversations with their local tertiary education providers, their local employers, and if it comes to light that maybe yes, we do need to change that kind of balance between completions and job openings, and that's a conversation that can be informed by this data. Now, this is a very broad look at the labour market. We're also trying to look specifically at those occupations that have very specific qualification requirements, often where they're regulated. So I'm thinking like health occupations and a number of trades. And so we're working on doing a similar matching analysis for those kinds of occupations. And here I've just cherry-picked some construction occupations that have specific qualification requirements. I've been working with a lot of the information, a lot of the very useful information on the careers.gov website, and that has a lot of information there about qualification requirements. So architects need master's degrees, electricians and scaffolders need apprenticeships. And you can see this bottom chart down here that what I've tried to look at is completions per job openings between 2015 and 2019. And finally, I'm running out of time, I've just realised. We can also look at those completions per job openings across regions. And so you can see, I'm just going to skip to the last slide here, where you can see that for scaffolders, there seems to be a lot of job openings in places like Auckland, but the number of completions by apprentices located in Auckland seems to be relatively low. And again, I'm just going to finish by saying what I've said before, that this wouldn't be the final word. You'd want to sit down and talk to people in this sector, talk to the people providing these qualifications, and if their feedback reinforces this sense that maybe there's a mismatch between completions and job openings, then you might want to do something about it. That took a little bit longer than I expected. I hope I've not gone too over time. Sorry about that.
No problem, Rob. I think there was lots of useful information and data in there. Just for point of clarification, so some of those later slides with the data, that's stuff that you're doing for TEC, is that right?
And we're not doing it for TEC. We're working closely with TEC to get those completion numbers, but we're developing an online interactive dashboard tool that's aimed at a number of different clients. We've got regional councils and TA councils in mind, and we've also got those new regional skills leadership groups in mind, the workforce development councils. But you know what, when I first came to New Zealand 20 years ago and joined the Departments of Labour, we were talking about skills, supply and demand and matching back then. It's a conversation that never seems to go away and never seems to be fully informed with good data. So we think that there's going to be a breadth of people who are going to be interested in this.
Rob, that reminds me of the fact that when you were at Business Strategies Limited, I was at the London Skills Forecasting Unit trying to do that work then. So yeah, that's a combination for a separate another day. So a couple of kind of questions that sort of come out of that. So you talked a little bit about the sort of the migrant skills coming back in, and so some of the again the information you presented, does that take into account the impact of closed borders in your forecast going forward?
Yeah, the data that I showed, I think, was 2017 to year to date. I think it was like year to February or something. So obviously the labour market's going to be a very different place for the next few years. You've got a number of migrants that are basically stuck in New Zealand, and the immigration minister has been extending those visas. But yeah, the doors are basically closed to new migrants that would otherwise have been coming here on work visas or residence visas. And I would expect that even when the borders start to be opened, if unemployment does rise as high as we expect it to, I would expect that our immigration settings would be tightened considerably. And we'd want to focus on those small pockets of the labour market where there might still be skill shortages, but I would be very surprised to see work visa migrants coming in anything like the numbers that they have been in previous years anytime soon.
And one thing that's obviously been quite a bit of commentary on in the media has been the issue of returning Kiwis, so passport holders coming back, potentially with a different kind of skills profile than people on work visas or skilled migrants. Does that show up anywhere in the numbers at this point, or is that something which is purely anecdotal at this stage?
It's not purely anecdotal. I think there are some statistics around that. One of my colleagues wrote a short piece about this recently, that perhaps the numbers might be overstating the number of returning Kiwis. We think a lot of people are coming back on kind of short-term trips. So I think that the key question is how many of these people are going to stay and settle in New Zealand, as opposed to kind of going back to their country of main residence once things start to settle down. I guess we'll just have to see how that washes out. But I'd be very surprised if the overall numbers had a really big impact on the labour market, and to the same kind of proportion that, say, all those work visa holders that were coming in the last few years. The number of people even now coming through the border is relatively small compared to what we've been seeing. But yeah, it is something we're going to be keeping an eye on
as well. And then the other question I had was related to, you talked about the regional forecasting model, and does that have the ability to sort of model some of the sort of almost policy on scenarios? So we've obviously talked a lot about things like shovel ready projects and new infrastructure investment into the regions. And, you know, if you take the Auckland example, where we already have a significant shortage of skilled labour in, say, construction, and if we're going to see further investment in infrastructure or other projects, the impact of that on the overall sort of, I guess, New Zealand labour market with the sort of issues of mobility, when we have a kind of finite pool and a lag in terms of training new employees for those sectors.
Yeah. Look, we have a whole side of the economics business is very much focused on the construction industry and doing construction forecasts, and we have top-down models, but we also have a lot of bottom-up information, which, you know, we scour the web to find out about these infrastructure projects and building projects. We have clients across the regions that are more than happy to kind of feed back to us what they're hearing on the ground. So yeah, as much as possible, our regional forecast, particularly our forecasts of regional construction industry, take into account as much of this building work that's going on as possible.
Right. Excellent. So there's no other questions that have come through now, and I think that's given us a really good insight to both some of the work that you're doing and things that are going to kind of come forward, which I think will be very interesting and useful for sort of economic developers, particularly as they respond to, you know, the kind of current circumstances and what they might mean for the labour market in a time when we're seeing lots of changes, as you've said, with regional skills leadership group, workforce development councils, etc. So quite an important sort of area for us to have a good understanding of what's available. So thank you once again for your time, and next time I'm in Wellington, I'll come and catch up on business strategies and London Skills Forecasting Unit days.
I'd love to reminisce. Absolutely, that'd be awesome, Patrick.
Okay, Rob, thanks very much. So that's the last session on day 3. So we've got through quite a lot of presentations and discussion today. If you missed any of the sessions, or because you can kind of join them, or you want to sort of look back at some of the presentations that have been made, just a reminder that Susan sort of is recording everything. It's all going to be uploaded in time for the next morning, so that's available as part of the resource pack. Tomorrow, usual story, we start again at 10 in the morning. Tomorrow's theme is around central local government response to COVID-19. We do keep the agenda online up to date, so it's worth just kind of checking back in with that so you can see the range of speakers tomorrow. But we'll be starting off at 10 with Ben Wallace, Principal Analyst at MB. I hope you've enjoyed today. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the morning. Thanks very much.